An Australian academic says immigration is an area where Canberra could get one up on China in the strategic competition for influence in the Pacific. Last week, the Labour government passed the legislation for its new Pacific Engagement Visa category. After months of uncertainty, the legislation required to implement the Pacific Engagement Visa passed through the Australian Senate, with the Greens and other crossbenchers providing the numbers the government needed in the face of opposition from the coalition. Modelled after New Zealand's Samoa quota and Pacific Access visas, it will be a first-of-its-kind pathway to residency in Australia for Pacific Islanders. Koroi Hawkins spoke with the director of the Development Policy Centre at the Australian National University, Professor Stephen Howes, about the new pathway.
This is a new visa. It's a completely new visa for Australia. And it's the first time that there'll be a Pacific window into Australia's permanent migration program. So it's actually modelled on similar New Zealand visas. In New Zealand, you have the Samoa quota and the Pacific Access category, and this will have a similar design. It'll have a wider scope, so it'll be open to pretty much all the countries of the Pacific, or of the Pacific Islands Forum. Yeah, at least those that don't already have a New Zealand passport. So I think Cook Islands, Niue are not included. I don't think the French, territories will be included, but most of the Pacific, it'll be open most of the Pacific Island Forum countries. And there'll be, just like with the New Zealand visas, there'll be a quota for each country. And the residents of that country will be able to enter a lottery or a ballot. And if their name is pulled out, they'll have a certain period, say 6 to 9 months, to find a job in Australia. They'll also have to pass some basic, health test, character test, English test. They pass all those tests, get a job. They're able to move to Australia, and they can stay for as long as they want. They'll become permanent residents.
What's driven this? Has there been a call for it? Has there been demand?
Yeah, I think there are several ways to look at it. One way is to see it as a sort of natural evolution. In 2007, we started the seasonal worker program, again, like the New Zealand RSE. And that was expanded around 2018 into the Pacific Labour Scheme. So for the seasonal worker program, workers come for, say, up to 9 months to do seasonal work on a farm. Then they go home. For the PLS, they can come for up to 4 years. Perhaps to work on a farm, but most of them actually work in abattoirs. And this is really the next step. So those are both temporary schemes for the Pacific, first seasonal, then multi-year. And I think this is the next step, which is giving opportunities not for temporary, but for permanent migration. So yeah, I think it's a natural evolution. I think what's driving it are several things. I think there's a growing realization that, migration is really important for the Pacific. And perhaps that aid is not the answer, so we need to look at alternative instruments. I think there have been calls from the Pacific. Well, we know there have been. I mean, there were calls, to introduce the seasonal worker program. More recently, there have been calls for visa-free access, easier travel. So this is definitely a step in that direction. I definitely wouldn't rule out, or it would be a mistake to ignore the influence of China. We all know there's a lot more strategic competition, and I think Australia is keen to bolster its ties to the Pacific. And migration is something Australia can offer that China can't really. Pacific Islanders aren't really going to migrate to China, but they definitely will migrate to Australia if they have the opportunity. And then I think the final factor is, there's actually two more factors. I think one is climate change. There's growing concern about climate change, and this is not the solution to climate change, but it does present another option for people whose countries are threatened by climate change. And then, there's a sense that there's underrepresentation of the Pacific in Australia. The number of the share of the Pacific diaspora in Australia is just a couple of percentage points. It's well below New Zealand. It's not really consistent with that sense of us being part of the Pacific family. And in particular, it's also very unbalanced. between different communities. So, we have a lot more Samoans, for example, or even Cook Islanders than we do Papua New Guineans. So those specific countries or citizens that have been able to come into Australia via New Zealand, they've come to Australia quite large numbers. But the countries that don't have that access that New Zealand's provided have really been shut out of Australia. And so this visa is especially going to be targeted to countries that are larger and that are underrepresented in Australia. So, yeah, it's a long answer, but I think there are a lot of things that have come together to produce this Pacific Engagement Visa.